My name is Rachel Monroe, and when I was 16 years old, I lay in a hospital bed listening to the monitors beep while my parents quietly weighed my life against my sister's college fund. The IV in my arm felt like ice, and every breath sounded too loud in that white humming room the doctor had just said the word serious, and my fingers dug into the thin blanket as if I could hold on to something solid. My mom stood at the foot of the bed with her arms folded tight, like she was holding herself together. My dad stared at the floor, as if there might be an answer written in the tiles. I kept telling myself it would be okay, because they were there, and parents are supposed to take care of their children. But as the doctor started talking about treatment and time and cost, I saw their faces harden in a way I had never seen before, and a quiet fear settled in my chest that had nothing to do with the illness growing inside me. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the invisible one in your own family. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, a 2-story place in a nice suburb with a trimmed lawn and a little flag by the mailbox, the kind of home people drive past and assume everything inside must be just as neat and orderly. My parents ran a college consulting business out of a small office downtown, helping other people's kids polish their applications and essays so they could get into dream schools all over the country. We went to church most Sundays, smiled in family photos, and sent cheerful holiday cards with matching sweaters and carefully chosen Bible verses about faith and sacrifice. If you saw us lined up in those pictures, you'd see my parents in the middle, my little sister Chloe in front with her bright smile, and me slightly to the side, tall and quiet, holding the family dog or the corner of a gift box. No one in those photos would know that inside our house, words like sacrifice and future almost always meant whatever needed to be done for Chloe, and that I had been taught in 100 small ways to stay grateful for whatever was left. From the time we were little, Chloe and I lived in 2 different versions of the same home. She had ballet lessons, summer camps, and birthday parties with themes and color-coordinated cupcakes, while I learned early how to make do with hand-me-downs and leftover decorations smiling from the edges of the pictures. When a teacher called home about Chloe's grades or a spot on some leadership team, my parents cleared their schedules and drove across town for a conference. When I brought home straight A's or a badge from the Honor Society, they would nod and ask if I could help Chloe with her math homework. They weren't cruel, not in the obvious ways people think of when they hear about bad parents. It was more like a steady tilt in the floor of our house, everything sliding toward Chloe without anyone ever saying out loud that she mattered more. We were told that we were a family that believed in hard work, faith, and investing in the future, but the future my parents talked about at dinner in the car and in quiet conversations they thought I couldn't hear was almost always spelled with Chloe's name. I tried to win a place in that future the only way I knew how. I stayed late at the library, joined every club I could, and volunteered wherever a clipboard needed a signature, hoping that one more ribbon or certificate might make them look at me the way they looked at my sister. At 12, when I placed in a regional science fair, I came home clutching my little plaque like it was a ticket to being seen, only to have my mom glance at it and ask me to keep the kitchen table clear because she was helping Chloe with a poster for a middle school talent show. My dad would say things like, "You're our steady one, Rachel. We don't have to worry about you," and it sounded like a compliment, until I realized it meant they assumed I would figure everything out on my own while they poured all their time, money, and attention into the child they called our big investment. I told myself it was fine, that being the quiet one, the dependable one, meant I was strong. But there were nights when I lay in bed and wondered what it would feel like if just once I were the one they rearranged their lives for. As we got older, the gap between our worlds only widened. My parents talked about Chloe's college plans like it was a group project the whole family was responsible for saving every extra dollar, planning visits and dropping names of scholarship directors and admissions officers they knew through their business. They built a story about us that they told at church and to their clients, a story where they were the devoted parents guiding 2 daughters toward bright futures, and I played my assigned role, the quiet, capable older girl who didn't need much. Inside, though, I was starting to notice how much of their love seemed to come with a price tag attached, how often they used phrases like return on investment when they talked about Chloe's activities, and how my own needs were always described as simple or easy to handle. I learned to swallow little disappointments, to tuck away medals and certificates in drawers, instead of leaving them on the counter to say, "No, it's okay," before anyone even offered. The hospital changed everything, but in a way, it also made the things I had ignored impossible to look away from. It started with a pain I couldn't explain, the kind that made every step feel heavy and every breath feel just a little too shallow, and my mom finally drove me to urgent care because I had turned so pale even Chloe commented on it at breakfast. One appointment turned into tests, and tests turned into being admitted just overnight. And then suddenly I was in a room on the 3rd floor with a plastic bracelet on my wrist and a machine tracing my heartbeat in thin green lines. My parents brought Chloe by once with a bouquet from the grocery store and a promise they had cleared their schedule to focus on me, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe this would be different, that being the one in the hospital bed meant they would have to see me. For a few hours, they sat in stiff chairs, while I dozed, my dad answering work emails on his phone, my mom flipping through a folder with Chloe's test scores and timelines for early applications, the pages whispering as she turned them. When Dr. Whitfield finally came in with a thick chart in his hands, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. He was kind but direct, the way you want a doctor to be when you already know something is wrong, and he explained in careful, steady words what they had found and what it meant. I heard the word serious, and I heard treatment, and time is important, and my mind started to float, clinging to one thought: my parents are here, they'll do whatever needs to be done. He laid out a plan step by step, talking about success rates and side effects, about the schedule we would need to follow if we wanted the best chance at recovery. My dad's hands were folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and my mom's face had gone very calm, the way it always did when she was negotiating a contract or talking to a new client, not a hair out of place. I was waiting to hear them ask what they needed to sign, what the next step would be, but then Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat and said we also needed to talk about cost, and as he turned the page of the chart and began to outline numbers and insurance gaps and payment plans, I watched something close over in my parents' eyes. When he finally set a stack of consent forms at the foot of my bed and handed my father a pen, the beeping of the monitor seemed to grow louder, and for the first time in my life I had the sinking feeling that the choice they were about to make might not include me at all. When the doctor placed the stack of consent forms on the counter, the room felt quieter than it had all morning. My father picked up the pen, holding it between his fingers like he was weighing something heavier than ink. My mother's posture stayed rigid, arms folded tight, eyes fixed on the medical chart, as if she could change the numbers by staring hard enough. I waited for one of them to speak, to ask a question to show that they understood the urgency in the doctor's voice, but neither of them moved. The monitor beside me tapped out a steady rhythm, and each beep felt like it echoed the seconds slipping away while they tried to decide what to do with me. Dr. Whitfield walked them through the forms again, explaining what the treatment required and how soon it needed to begin. He spoke gently, giving them space to absorb the information, but there was a firmness in his tone that told me delay wasn't an option. When he paused, my mother finally exhaled a slow, controlled breath and said they needed a moment outside. They stepped into the hallway, the door swinging closed behind them with a soft click that made the room feel suddenly cold. I looked toward the doorway, half expecting them to return quickly, but the minutes stretched on without a sound beyond distant footsteps and the hum of the fluorescent lights. Nurse Jenna came in to check my vitals. She kept her voice light, asking how I was feeling, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway more than once. When she tightened the cuff on my arm, she glanced at the unopened consent forms, and then back at me with a look I couldn't decipher. "They'll be back soon," she said, offering a small smile before stepping out again. Her reassurance should have helped, but all it did was highlight the growing unease in my chest. I tried to take a deeper breath, but the uncertainty settled heavier with each moment. When my parents returned, their expressions told me more than their words ever could. My father avoided my gaze entirely, staring at the foot of the bed, as if there was something written there only he could read. My mother lifted her chin, her voice steady but clipped, and said they couldn't proceed with the treatment. She explained that the cost was far beyond what they could manage right now, and that they had already allocated everything they had to Chloe's college plan. Her tone never wavered, but her eyes stayed flat, as if the decision had been made long before the doctor ever walked into my room. I tried to ask if they understood what the doctor had said about urgency, but the words came out thin and shaky. My mother placed a hand on the edge of the bed, though she didn't touch me, and repeated that they had no choice. My father murmured something about needing to focus on the future and said he trusted that things would work out the way they were meant to. Then, without offering anything more, they both stepped back from the bed. I watched them turn toward the door, my father reaching for the handle while my mother adjusted her purse strap. They didn't promise to return. They didn't offer comfort. They simply walked away, the door closing behind them with a soft thud that made everything inside me feel strangely hollow. For a moment, I lay completely still, as if movement might break whatever thin thread was keeping me steady. The room felt larger somehow, the corners farther away, and the steady pulse of the monitor reminded me of the silence they left behind. Nurse Jenna reappeared a few minutes later, her expression shifting when she realized they were gone. She asked whether they were coming back, but I didn't know how to answer. The truth sat heavy on my tongue, and I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. She hesitated, then gently squeezed my shoulder before stepping aside as the social worker Carla Ruiz entered with a clipboard in hand. Carla introduced herself and sat beside the bed, speaking quietly as she explained the situation. She asked if my parents had signed anything, whether they had given any indication of their plans, and whether there was another adult who could step in. I struggled through my responses, trying to keep my voice from shaking. When she asked about extended family, the first name that came to mind was my grandmother's, even though I hadn't seen her in nearly a year. My mother rarely spoke about her anymore, and the last time I heard her name in our house, it had been during an argument muttered behind a half-closed door. Still, I said her name, hoping she might answer the phone. Carla wrote down the number I gave her and said she would try to make contact immediately. She stepped out of the room, and I listened to her voice drift down the hall as she spoke quietly into the phone. A few moments later, the nearby elevator chimed, and footsteps hurried closer. When the door swung open, my grandmother Evelyn entered with the kind of energy that seemed too big for her small frame. Her coat was unbuttoned, her gray curls scattered by the wind, and her eyes were wide with worry. She moved toward me without hesitation, taking my hand in both of hers, as she asked if I was all right. Her presence filled the room with a warmth I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She didn't raise her voice or demand explanations. She simply held my hand as if grounding me where I lay. When Dr. Whitfield came in to explain the treatment again, she listened carefully, nodding at every detail. She asked questions, clarified steps, and when he paused at the cost, she didn't flinch. She said they would make it work. She asked where to sign. Her voice did not tremble once. As the forms were completed and plans were set into motion, I noticed how she stayed close to the bed, adjusting the blanket, brushing a loose strand of hair away from my face. The contrast between the mother who had just walked out and the grandmother who now stood beside me felt sharp, but Evelyn never spoke about any of it. She focused only on the road ahead, on getting me through what was coming next. Later, when the room settled into a gentler quiet and the evening light dimmed through the blinds, she unpacked a small bag she had brought with her. Inside were fresh pajamas, a soft blanket, and a small wooden music box I recognized from her house, its paint worn in places from years of use. She set it on the table beside me and wound the little key until a familiar tune filled the room. She sat in the chair at my bedside, her hands folded loosely, and hummed along as if we were back in her living room the way we used to be when I was small. As the night deepened, she told me she would be staying in town as long as I needed her. She said we would figure everything out together, that we weren't going to wait for answers from people who had already made their decision. Her voice stayed steady, but I could see the worry in her eyes each time she looked at the IV or the monitor. She didn't hide it, and she didn't pretend everything was fine. She simply stayed, which was something no one else had done that day. When the nurses came to prepare for the first phase of treatment, she stepped aside just enough to give them space, but never far from my reach. And when they dimmed the lights and wished us a good night, she leaned back in the chair, pulled a blanket over her lap, and settled in as if she planned to stay awake for as long as it took. I lay listening to the soft hum of the machines, the faint melody from the music box, and the quiet sound of her breathing beside me. For the first time since the doctor had spoken, the tightness in my chest eased a little. I didn't know exactly what the next day would bring or which choices my parents might make from here, but I knew one thing with certainty: I wasn't facing any of it alone. And as the night settled around us, something steady and new began to take shape, waiting for whatever came next. The first few days after treatment began moved slowly, marked by the rhythm of nurses checking in, machines humming, and my grandmother's quiet presence beside me. When they finally allowed me to go home with strict instructions, Evelyn drove with both hands on the wheel, glancing over every few minutes as if she needed to make sure I was still awake. The drive to her house felt longer than it really was, the scenery moving past the windows in soft shapes, while I tried to settle into the idea that I wouldn't be going back to my own home. When we pulled into her small driveway, she put the car in park and told me she had set up the guest room for me, adding that it might need a few more blankets if the night stayed cool. Inside the house smelled faintly of mint tea and old books. She guided me down the hallway with one hand on my shoulder, stopping at the doorway of the guest room. Fresh sheets were tucked tight across the bed, and a small lamp with a warm glow waited on the nightstand. Taped to the mirror above the dresser was a note written in her careful handwriting that said, "You are safe here." I stood there for a moment, reading those words again, as she set my overnight bag at the foot of the bed. She didn't press me to talk or ask questions about what had happened. She simply told me that dinner would be ready soon, and that I should rest until then. The first nights were quiet. When I woke from light sleep, I could hear her footsteps moving through the hallway or the soft click of her turning pages in the living room. She checked on me gently, asking whether I needed water or another blanket, and she didn't seem bothered by the way I hesitated before answering. In the mornings, she made oatmeal with a sprinkle of cinnamon and always placed a small folded napkin beside the bowl. She talked about simple things: an article she had read, the neighborhood cat she saw near the porch, a recipe she wanted to try if I felt up to it. Those small conversations filled the space without demanding anything from me, and I found myself listening more closely than I expected, just to hear the steadiness in her voice. As the weeks passed, my strength returned little by little. Some days I walked from one end of the house to the other, leaning on the wall when I felt unsteady. Other days I sat bundled in a blanket on the porch while Evelyn trimmed plants or wiped the outdoor table with a cloth. She kept her pace slow so I could follow the movement without feeling left behind. On one of those afternoons, she brought out her laptop and a neat stack of papers, setting them on the small porch table. She explained she had been calling clinics, foundations, and any group that might help with costs. When I tried to tell her she didn't have to do all of that, she just shook her head and said she wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. There were moments when memories of home slipped into my thoughts, without warning, like shadows passing across a wall. I remembered sitting in the back seat while my parents discussed Chloe's weekend plans, or the way they spoke about her achievements with bright enthusiasm. I thought about the time I won a regional writing contest and placed the certificate on the kitchen counter, hoping my mother might ask about it. The next morning, I found it tucked under a stack of mail with a note reminding me to help Chloe with a project that afternoon. Back then, I had told myself that being overlooked wasn't intentional, that they were simply busy or distracted. In Evelyn's house, where every gesture carried care, those memories felt different, as if I could finally see the places where I had been standing alone for a long time. One evening while we were eating a simple dinner of soup and bread, she set down her spoon and looked at me thoughtfully. She said I seemed more like myself than she had seen in years. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I asked what she meant. She talked about how children sometimes grow quiet when there's no room for their voices, and how they find pieces of themselves again when they feel safe. Her words settled over the table in a calm way that made the room feel warm. I didn't say much, but I listened carefully, noticing how she didn't mention my parents directly or offer explanations for their choices. She simply focused on the present moment, as though that was what needed tending. Each day brought small steps back toward routine. I helped fold laundry or chop a few vegetables while seated at the kitchen counter when my energy allowed. Other times I read aloud from a book while she knitted the yarn, moving steadily between her fingers. She never hurried me, even on days when I could barely make it through a few pages. When I thanked her for everything she was doing, she waved the gratitude away gently, telling me I didn't owe her anything except honesty about how I was feeling. Her patience made it easier to breathe. As autumn approached, she encouraged me to take short walks with her. We started with the length of the block, stopping at the corner to rest on the low stone wall near the walkway. Leaves began turning gold and red, and the afternoon air carried a cooler edge. During those walks, we talked about books we had both read, the little herb garden she hoped to plant in the spring, and the neighbors she had known for decades. She rarely asked about my parents, but she listened carefully when I mentioned something from the past. I didn't go into detail, just small moments like missing a school concert because Chloe had a practice, or being told to take the smaller share of something because Chloe needed it more. Evelyn didn't react with shock or judgment. She just let the stories sit between us without trying to reshape them. There were nights when sleep came harder, and I found myself awake long after the house had gone still. On those nights, I would sit in the small guest room and look at the music box she had placed on the table. Its soft melody filled the space with a gentleness I didn't realize I had missed. Sometimes she would appear at the doorway holding 2 mugs of tea, saying she had heard footsteps and wondered if I was awake. We would sit on the couch with the lights dimmed, sipping tea in comfortable silence until the weight in my chest eased enough for me to rest. As my energy improved, I felt restless in a way I couldn't quite explain. I wanted to contribute something, even if it was small. When I mentioned the idea of tutoring online, Evelyn looked surprised at first, then thoughtful. She asked whether I felt strong enough, and when I nodded, she helped me set up a quiet space at the dining table. I started with one student who needed help with algebra. Then another reached out, and soon I had a few hours a week filled with sessions. The extra income helped with smaller expenses, but more than that, it made me feel capable again. The routine of tutoring brought new conversations into the house. I found myself talking through lesson plans or sharing small stories from the sessions, and Evelyn listened with the same attention she gave everything else. She said it was good to see me engaged in something that used my strengths. I realized how different it felt to have someone recognize effort without comparing it to anything or anyone else. As the weather cooled and the days grew shorter, I felt myself settling more fully into the quiet rhythm of her home. There were still moments when old thoughts crept in, but they didn't linger the way they once had. Evelyn's presence created a steady balance, and the house had a way of holding the long days gently. One afternoon, while we were sitting on the porch with blankets across our laps, I asked whether she ever missed the noise of a fuller household. She smiled and said she liked things just as they were, adding that it was nice to have company she didn't have to worry about. She said it warmly, reaching over to pat my hand. Her touch was light, but something in her expression reminded me of all the times she had reached out in simple ways when I was younger. As the afternoon light shifted across the yard, she asked what I hoped to do next, once I was feeling stronger. The question caught me off guard, not because it was surprising, but because no one had asked me that in a long time. I didn't have a clear answer yet, but she didn't seem to mind. She just nodded and said there was time to figure it out. In the weeks that followed, autumn settled fully into the neighborhood. Leaves covered the sidewalks, and the air smelled of wood smoke from chimneys nearby. Each day felt like a small step toward something steadier, even if I couldn't see the full picture yet. The house, the routine, and the quiet companionship with my grandmother created a sense of grounding I hadn't expected. As the season shifted, I noticed an undercurrent in myself, something calm but determined waiting quietly beneath the surface. I didn't know yet what it would become, but I could feel it gathering, ready to shape what came next. As the months settled into a gentle rhythm at my grandmother's house, my strength returned slowly, the kind that showed itself in small, steady ways. Some days I managed a full walk around the block without stopping, and other days I helped peel vegetables at the kitchen counter, while Evelyn hummed along to the radio. She paid attention to each improvement without making a fuss about it, giving me space to move at a pace that felt manageable. The quieter moments at her home made it easier to see pieces of myself that had been pushed aside for so long, and I noticed how often I watched her for cues about what came next. She didn't talk much about the past, letting the days settle into their own pattern, and I followed that rhythm without question. One afternoon, while sunlight filtered through the living room windows, I found myself looking at an old photograph on her bookshelf. It showed a much younger version of me standing in her backyard, holding a paper crown she had made for my birthday. The memory felt distant, but the way she had looked at me in the picture, steady, proud, and warm, stood out more clearly than the event itself. She walked in with 2 glasses of water and found me studying the photo. Without interrupting my thoughts, she set a glass beside me and took her usual seat in the armchair. She said the crown had fallen apart the same day, but that I had worn it until bedtime anyway. Her voice held a soft humor that eased the small knot forming in my chest, and I nodded as I placed the photo back on the shelf. As the weeks passed, I noticed how my appetite improved and how I could stay awake longer without feeling drained. Evelyn marked each follow-up appointment on her calendar in neat blue ink, reminding me gently the night before and driving me without hesitation. At the clinic, she asked practical questions and took notes in a small spiral notebook she carried everywhere. During one visit, the nurse remarked on how much stronger I looked, and Evelyn smiled, as if she had been waiting to hear that for months. When we walked back to the car afterward, the air felt lighter, though I wasn't sure whether it was because of the doctor's encouraging words or the way my grandmother squeezed my hand as we crossed the parking lot. Not long after that appointment, I returned to my tutoring sessions with more consistency. The students I worked with were patient on the days I needed to move a little slower and enthusiastic when I explained difficult topics in ways they could understand. Their steady progress helped build a quiet confidence in me, and each small success gave the house a brighter tone. Evelyn often paused in the hallway when she heard my voice through the cracked door, listening for a moment before moving on with her day. When I finished a session, she sometimes asked how it went, and she listened as if each detail mattered. On an early winter evening, we sat together at the dining table sharing a simple dinner. She watched me for a moment before asking if I felt different. I didn't know how to answer right away, so I took a slow sip of water. She said she felt as though I had more room to breathe more ease in the way I moved through her home. Her observation surprised me, but it also made sense in a way I hadn't fully realized. We talked briefly about how people sometimes grow accustomed to feeling overlooked without noticing the weight of it until they step away from the environment that shaped them. She didn't mention my parents by name or dwell on their decisions. She simply acknowledged the shift she saw and let the thought rest there on the table between us. As winter deepened, the days grew shorter and the evenings colder, and I found myself reflecting quietly during our walks. We passed houses with lights in the windows and yards covered in a thin layer of frost, and each step seemed to bring forward memories I hadn't touched in years. I thought about the spelling bee medal tucked away in my old bedroom drawer, the one I had brought home with excitement, only to be asked not to wear at the dinner table. I remembered the times I had waited at the kitchen counter with news to share, only to stop myself when my mother rushed past me to help Chloe prepare for another activity. None of those moments felt dramatic when they happened. They were simply part of the rhythm of my life. But in the quiet of Evelyn's neighborhood, each memory struck a little differently. One afternoon, I received a notification on my phone from a social media account I hadn't checked in months. I opened it without thinking and saw a new post from my parents showing Chloe's acceptance to a selective summer program. They stood beside her with bright smiles, balloons tied to the back of a dining chair, and a caption celebrating her next milestone. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement of where I was or what I was facing, and I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Evelyn walked into the room with a stack of folded towels, noticing the stillness in my expression. She didn't ask what I was looking at, but she set the towels down and rested her hand briefly on my shoulder before leaving the room. Her quiet understanding grounded me, and after a moment, I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the table. In the following days, my grandmother suggested we sort through some of my school papers, partly to help me stay organized, and partly to decide what needed to be returned to the house I used to live in. As we sifted through old folders and notebooks, we found projects I had forgotten about and essays I had poured hours into. She read a few lines here and there, smiling softly at the care I had put into them. She made no remarks about how my efforts had been overlooked at home, or how often my accomplishments had been set aside in favor of Chloe's, but her attention to these small pieces of my past helped me see them with new clarity. Later that week, she asked if I wanted to help plant a small herb garden for the spring. We sat at the table with seed catalogs and scraps of paper sketching out simple rows and possible varieties. The conversation drifted easily from memories of her old garden to stories of neighbors who had brought over fresh tomatoes in past years. She talked about the patience required to tend plants, how some needed extra care or a bit more sunlight to thrive. I listened quietly, moved by the way she described growth as something steady and deliberate. One evening just before dinner, she stood at the stove stirring a pot of soup while I chopped a few carrots at the counter. She looked over and asked if I had given any thought to what I wanted for myself beyond recovery. The question wasn't pressured. It came out gently, as if she was giving me permission to consider possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. I told her I wasn't sure yet, and she nodded with understanding. She reminded me that some answers arrive gradually, and that there was no need to rush toward them. The kitchen filled with the aroma of simmering broth, and the moment lingered in a way that felt comforting. As winter approached its end, I noticed a calmness in myself that hadn't been there before. The steady routine, the warm meals, and the soft conversations with my grandmother created a sense of foundation I hadn't realized I needed. My days no longer revolved around trying to earn someone's attention or wondering whether my efforts were enough. Instead, they were filled with manageable tasks, moments of learning, and chances to consider what might lie ahead. There were still difficult nights when old memories rose to the surface uninvited and sharp, but even then, the weight of them felt different. They didn't pull me under the way they once had, and I found it easier to let them pass. On one of those nights, I heard Evelyn moving quietly in the hallway, and she appeared at my door with a soft knock. She held 2 mugs of tea and asked if I wanted company for a little while. We sat on the couch under a blanket listening to the soft hum of the heater. She didn't ask what was bothering me, and I didn't try to explain. We simply shared the space until the stillness felt gentler. As winter thawed and hints of spring appeared in the branches outside, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, just a quiet recognition that I had room to grow in ways I hadn't expected. The calm I felt wasn't tied to being unseen or overlooked. It came from the freedom to exist without proving my place. That awareness settled into me with a sense of quiet strength, steady and clear, ready to guide whatever came next. As early spring settled in, the days stretched a little longer and the chill in the air softened. I spent more time by the window in the guest room, letting the afternoon light warm my shoulders while I worked through my tutoring sessions. The sounds of the neighborhood lawnmowers starting up for the first time in months, kids tapping basketballs down the street filtered through the open window. Each day felt steady, and I moved through the routines with a sense of calm that had taken months to feel natural. Evelyn often paused in the doorway when she saw me smiling at something a student said, and she would nod as if she was pleased to see my energy return in small, sure steps. One quiet morning after finishing a session, I decided to go through old files on my phone. It started as a simple task to clear space, but as I scrolled, I came across folders I had avoided for a long time. Tucked inside were screenshots I barely remembered, taking text messages between my parents' conversations they must have assumed I would never see. I opened one, then another, feeling a slow heaviness settle over me as I read the words. My mother had written to my sister about not worrying too much about me, saying I would come home once the mood passed. My father had added that he didn't want to risk jeopardizing Chloe's future over uncertainty, assuring her that I was strong enough to manage on my own. I sat with the phone resting against my knee, the light from the window falling across the screen. The messages weren't new in sentiment, but seeing the words laid out so plainly felt different than remembering the tone of their voices in the hospital. I kept scrolling and found a few more conversations, each one carrying the same thread: decisions made quickly and explained away with the kind of confidence that suggested they hadn't paused to consider another path. I heard Evelyn moving around in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinet doors as she began preparing lunch. The familiar sounds grounded me, and I placed the phone beside me, taking a steady breath. I didn't feel the way I once had when memories of my parents surfaced, but the messages stirred something quiet inside me, a recognition that my parents still lived in a story they created, one where leaving me behind made sense to them. After lunch, I helped dry the dishes, while Evelyn stacked them neatly in the cupboards. She mentioned needing to review a few letters from her book club and asked if I wanted to join her in the living room afterward. I agreed, and we spent an hour reading side by side, occasionally sharing passages that caught our attention. The peaceful rhythm of the afternoon made the earlier discovery on my phone feel less overwhelming, but it didn't leave my thoughts entirely. Later that evening, I returned to the guest room to finish a few assignments for school and found myself thinking about the Langford Scholars Network. My parents had talked about it for years, describing it as a vital connection for Chloe's academic future. They mentioned Patricia Langford, often praising her accomplishments and the prestige her foundation carried. They had attended events hosted by the organization and kept brochures on their office shelves, always placing them in view where clients could see. Her endorsement was woven into every part of their business. I opened my laptop and typed Patricia Langford's name into the search bar. Page after page of articles appeared, interviews, scholarship announcements, and speeches she had given over the years. Her work focused on supporting students with ambition and integrity, emphasizing the importance of honesty and ethical responsibility. I read through several of the articles, taking in the values she spoke about in her interviews. The contrast between her message and the way my parents had shaped their story about me grew clearer with each paragraph. As I sat there, I glanced again at the screenshots on my phone. The pieces felt like they belonged together, forming a picture that someone outside our family might understand differently. My parents had built a public image grounded in mentorship and guidance, promising families that they cared deeply about the futures of every student who came through their doors. The people who trusted them believed those promises. I wondered if Patricia Langford knew anything about what had happened in that hospital room, or the choices my parents made with such certainty. I hesitated for a long moment before opening a blank email. The cursor blinked at the top of the page, waiting for me to begin. I didn't want to write with anger or accusation. That wasn't what this moment was about. Instead, I focused on the facts, what had happened, what had been said, and what I could prove. I wrote my full name, identifying myself as Thomas and Linda Monroe's older daughter. I described the day at the hospital as clearly as I could, detailing the treatment plan and the decision my parents made not to move forward. I explained that I survived because my grandmother stepped in, not because my parents chose to. As I continued, I attached the hospital letter documenting the denial of care and the screenshots of the conversations I had found. I added Carla Ruiz's written summary from the neglect report, which she had given me after the case was closed. When I reached the final line, I paused and typed a simple sentence: "I thought you should know who you are endorsing." I read the email twice before pressing send, feeling a steady calm settle over me. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't wait for one. I closed the laptop gently and set it aside on the nightstand. The next morning, the world looked just the same. I made tea while Evelyn prepared breakfast, and we talked about the weather and the errands she needed to run. She didn't ask why I seemed quieter than usual, but she watched me with the same steady attention she always did. I felt no need to explain, and she didn't press. We moved through the day with our usual ease, each moment carrying the same quiet rhythm we had grown used to. A week later, while sorting through some paperwork for school, I came across a brochure from my parents' business. The front displayed a photo of them smiling in front of a classroom with the Langford Scholars Network badge printed prominently at the bottom. I didn't think much of it until later that night when something nudged me to look at their website. When I typed the address into my browser, the homepage loaded with a new layout. The badge that had always been centered beneath their logo was gone. I clicked through a few pages and saw that it had been removed everywhere, as though it had never been part of their branding. I searched the Foundation's public directory next. Their names no longer appeared on the list of partner consultants. There was no announcement or explanation, just a quiet absence where their listing had always been. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the change with a slow breath. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't need to be. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. In the days that followed, I returned to my routine. I completed assignments, tutored students, and spent time with Evelyn in the garden planning which herbs we would plant when the soil warmed. My grandmother always moved through tasks with a measured patience, and working beside her helped me keep the pace steady. Our conversations flowed easily, touching on books, recipes, and plans for the coming months. One afternoon, she asked if I wanted to bake lemon bread with her. I agreed, and we spent the next hour zesting lemons and mixing batter. She handed me the whisk when my arm grew tired, offering a gentle smile. While the bread baked, the warm scent filled the kitchen, and she talked about how she learned to cook from her own mother by watching and practicing slowly. I listened, feeling the familiar weight of her calm guidance settle around us. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood. The air carried the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day, and the sky had begun to darken. I thought about the email I had sent, the small step I had taken towards something larger. I didn't know exactly what would unfold from it, but I felt grounded in the choice, steady in a way that had taken months to reach. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch with a shawl draped over her shoulders and sat beside me without speaking. We watched the streetlights blink on one by one, the silence between us comfortable and familiar. After a while, she reached over and lightly squeezed my hand, a quiet gesture that felt like acknowledgement. The moment passed gently, leaving behind a sense of calm I carried with me into the night. The world around me was shifting slowly but unmistakably, and I could feel the next steps gathering just beneath the surface, waiting for their time to unfold. Spring deepened, and the routines at my grandmother's house grew familiar. Morning tea tutoring sessions, slow walks, and quiet evenings where the sound of the radio drifted softly through the rooms. I continued checking in on schoolwork and keeping up with my appointments, and each week brought a little more steadiness to my body. Though life there felt calm, I noticed subtle changes coming from outside our small world. It began with small hints, emails from my old teachers asking if I needed assignments, messages from classmates wondering how long I'd be away, and the occasional photo of Chloe posted online that made its way to my feed. Most showed her smiling at events my parents had once talked about, as if only she belonged in that future. One afternoon, I sat at the dining table grading worksheets for a student when I received a notification from the school's website. They were preparing for the end-of-year awards, and the announcement list had been posted. Out of habit, I opened the document and scanned the names. Chloe appeared several times for activities and competitions she had entered, and I felt a gentle stir of pride for her accomplishments. Then I found my own name further down the list, included in a category I had forgotten I was even nominated for. It carried the same quiet recognition I had grown used to acknowledged, but tucked among larger announcements centered around my sister. I showed the list to Evelyn later that evening while she prepared dinner. She read through it carefully and smiled as she handed the phone back to me, offering a simple comment about how hard I had worked. Her tone was warm, but not overly sentimental, and I appreciated the easy respect in her words. She moved on to ask whether I wanted extra herbs in the soup, and the conversation returned to its usual rhythm. Later that week, while sorting through more school notices, I checked my parents' business website again. The missing Langford Scholars Badge caught my eye, reminding me of the email I had sent weeks earlier. I clicked through the site, noting the subtle changes, different wording, fewer testimonials, and a cleaner layout. Something felt unfinished about the updates, as if they had been made quickly with the hope no one would notice. I put down my phone and walked to the kitchen where Evelyn was arranging fresh flowers in a small ceramic vase. I mentioned the changes I had seen, keeping my voice even. She glanced up and listened quietly, her hand steady as she finished trimming the stems. She didn't offer an opinion or ask for details, simply nodding, as if acknowledging a shift in the background that didn't require immediate conversation. Her calmness helped me stay grounded, and we continued with our evening as usual. Over the next few days, I noticed additional signs that something was happening behind the scenes. A family friend who hadn't contacted me in months reached out with a brief message asking how I was doing. A neighbor from our old street called to check on my grandmother, her voice carrying a note of concern she didn't quite explain. I thanked them for thinking of us, but didn't press for information. The quiet pattern of these messages made me wonder whether news had begun to travel in small circles. Then one morning near the end of April, I woke to several unread emails. Most were notifications from the tutoring platforms I used, but one message came from a parent I had never met in person, someone whose child had worked with my parents' business in the past. She asked whether I could help her daughter with a few college preparation questions, saying she had recently changed service providers. Her phrasing suggested something more than a simple switch, but I kept my reply polite and straightforward, offering times for a consultation. When I finished typing, I sat for a moment with my hands resting on the keyboard, aware that the edges of my parents' professional world seemed to be unraveling quietly. A few days later, as I was finishing a tutoring session, I heard the soft rustle of the mail slot opening. Evelyn brought in the day's mail and placed a small stack on the dining table, glancing through the envelopes to see what belonged to her. One letter had my name on it, written in a careful looping script. I opened it after finishing my work, unsure what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note from my former guidance counselor saying she had heard that I was recovering and wanted to check on me. She mentioned that the school had received inquiries about my sudden absence and hoped I was getting the support I needed. Her words were thoughtful and precise, carrying the tone of someone who had always taken her role seriously. I showed the letter to my grandmother that evening. She read it quietly and then suggested we prepare a reply together. We sat at the dining table with a cup of tea beside us, drafting a short response thanking the counselor for her concern. Evelyn offered gentle suggestions about clarity and tone, and when we sealed the envelope, she handed it to me with a small, encouraging smile. Days continued to pass with the slow, steady pace that had become familiar. Yet beneath the calm surface, I sensed an undercurrent of change. It surfaced again the following week when I checked in on my parents' business page out of curiosity. The schedule of upcoming workshops, once filled with school partnerships and presentations, had been updated with several cancellations. A brief notice stated that some events would be postponed, but the change in tone was hard to miss. The once busy calendar now showed more empty spaces than planned engagements. I didn't mention any of this to Evelyn right away. Instead, I focused on my daily routines, completing my assignments, tending the small herb seedlings we had started, and helping with chores around the house. But one evening, while we were cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, she paused and looked at me with a gentle expression. She said she could sense something on my mind. I told her about the cancellations I had seen and the messages that had been trickling in. She listened without interrupting, and then said that some things reveal themselves slowly often, without our needing to name them. On a warm afternoon in early May, she and I planted the herb garden we had planned for weeks. The soil was soft from recent rain, and we pressed the small seedlings into the earth carefully, giving each one a place to grow. As we worked, she spoke about how plants often respond to quiet changes in the weather, long before people notice what's shifting in the air. Her words carried a calm observation, not a lesson, and I let the meaning settle naturally. Later that evening, while watering the newly planted herbs, my phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from a former classmate saying she had heard something about my parents' business losing a major partnership. She didn't know the details and apologized for bringing it up if the topic was sensitive. I thanked her and kept the reply brief. Still, the message confirmed something I had sensed growing for weeks, a quiet unraveling that extended beyond just one severed partnership. The following weekend, while sorting laundry in the living room, I checked the website again. Several new announcements had been posted, more canceled workshops, a delay on a planned program, and a short message indicating that the company was reassessing future offerings. The language was vague, but the shift in tone was noticeable. I stared at the screen for a long moment before turning off my phone. That night after dinner, I sat on the porch with Evelyn as the sky deepened into shades of blue. She brought out 2 mugs of tea and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The air carried the soft hum of insects waking for the season, and the streetlights flickered on across the neighborhood. After a few minutes of quiet, I told her the latest updates I had seen. She listened with the same calm attention she always gave, folding her hands around her mug as she considered my words. When I finished, she nodded and said that sometimes when people build their lives on a certain story, change arrives quietly and in pieces before anyone sees the full picture. I rested my hands on the railing and let her words settle into the cool evening air. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The silence didn't feel heavy. It simply belonged to the moment. As the night grew darker, a soft breeze drifted through the yard carrying the scent of the herb garden we had planted earlier. The quiet changes around me no longer felt distant. They were moving closer, waiting for their next step. I didn't know what would come next, but the path ahead was starting to take shape, steady and unmistakable. In early June, the school year's end brought a wave of events and gatherings, and one afternoon I received an email from a youth mentorship group inviting me to speak on a panel about navigating challenges during adolescence. They had heard about my tutoring work through a local counselor and thought I could offer guidance to younger students. I read the invitation twice before showing it to Evelyn at the kitchen table. She looked over the message carefully and nodded, saying it sounded like something I might enjoy. I agreed after a moment, choosing a date that gave me enough time to prepare without feeling rushed. The event took place in a modest community center on a warm Saturday morning. Rows of folding chairs filled the main room, and colorful posters lined the walls with encouraging messages. When we arrived, volunteers handed us programs and pointed the speakers toward a set of tables near the stage. I checked in with the coordinator, a friendly woman who thanked me for participating and walked me through the schedule. Evelyn found a seat near the back, offering a small wave before settling in with her purse on her lap. The panel discussion was scheduled for the late morning session. I waited backstage with two other speakers, both older than me and experienced in student outreach. They introduced themselves warmly and asked about my background. When it was our turn, the coordinator led us to 3 chairs on stage. A soft buzz of conversation filled the room as people found their seats. Once the moderator began, the atmosphere grew attentive, and the discussion moved smoothly through topics about resilience, academic pressure, and finding supportive communities. When it was my turn to speak, I focused on the tutoring work I had been doing and the importance of asking for help when things felt overwhelming. I talked about adjusting to unexpected changes and finding strength in small steps. The room stayed quiet as I spoke with several people nodding along. When the moderator wrapped up the session, the audience applauded, and we stepped off stage to the side area where volunteers had set up refreshments. I took a bottle of water and looked toward the back of the room, trying to spot my grandmother. As I started walking toward her, I noticed 2 familiar figures standing near the exit. My parents stood close together, watching me with expressions that looked worn and uncertain. My mother's hair was held in a loose clip instead of her usual polished style, and my father's jacket hung unevenly across his shoulders. Their eyes followed me as I approached, though neither of them moved at first. When I reached them, my mother took a tentative step forward. "Rachel," she said quietly, her voice strained. "Could we talk for a moment?" Her gaze flicked toward the floor before meeting mine again. My father cleared his throat and added, "We didn't know if you'd be willing to speak with us." He shifted his weight as if bracing for an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. I gave a small nod, waiting. My mother's eyes glistened, and she clasped her hands together. "We know things haven't been right," she whispered. "We've lost so much. The business isn't doing well. People pulled away. We don't know how to fix it." My father rubbed the back of his neck and said, "We never expected all of this. We didn't understand how serious everything was. We didn't know if you would even make it." His voice wavered near the end. I held their gaze steady and quiet. My mother stepped closer, her voice trembling. "We're asking for a little help. Anything you can do. We're struggling to keep things together." A long moment passed as the background noise of the room faded. I thought of the night in the hospital, the steady beep of the monitors, and the way they had walked out of the room without looking back. The memory came without bitterness, just as a fact of what had happened. I met their eyes and spoke calmly. "When I was in the hospital, you said you couldn't afford my care." My mother's face fell. My father's shoulders sagged. I continued, "You made a choice. I had to live with it." The simplicity of the statement hung between us, leaving little room for interpretation. My father reached for words that didn't come. My mother blinked quickly, her voice barely a whisper. "We're doing the best we can now." I nodded once, not unkindly. "So am I." I stepped past them toward the exit, walking with a steady pace. Neither of them called after me. They remained standing near the door, their expressions a mixture of longing and resignation. I walked through the hallway, toward the back of the building where Evelyn waited near the benches with her purse in her lap. When she saw me, she stood and reached for my hand. Her fingers closed gently around mine as we walked to the car without speaking. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, stretching long lines across the polished floor. Once we reached the parking lot, she finally turned to me. "Ready to go home?" she asked softly. I nodded, and we got into the car. The drive back followed the familiar route past the park with its tall maple trees, across the small bridge near the library, and toward the quiet neighborhood where her yellow house waited. When we pulled into the driveway, she cut the engine and placed her hand lightly on my arm. She didn't ask how the conversation had gone. Instead, she said, "Let's have tea on the porch this evening. The weather should be nice." Her voice carried the same steady reassurance I had grown accustomed to, and I felt a calm ease settle in my chest. Later that night, we sat on the porch wrapped in light blankets, listening to the wind rustle through the newly grown leaves. She poured tea for both of us, and the soft clink of the cups felt grounding. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun dipping low beyond the rooftops as shadows lengthened across the yard. After a few minutes, I spoke softly. "I saw them today." Evelyn didn't react with surprise. She set her cup down carefully and listened, her gaze steady. "They wanted help," I continued. "They said they'd lost everything." She breathed out slowly. "And what did you say I told them? I was doing my best, too." She nodded, her eyes warm with something I couldn't quite name. She reached over and lay her hand over mine, offering a gentle squeeze. I didn't say anything more, and neither did she. We sat there until the sky shifted to deeper shades of blue, the air cooling as night fully settled in. When we finally went inside, I felt a quiet clarity settle over me, something steady and sure. The path ahead felt different now, open in a way it hadn't been before. As I got ready for bed, I sensed that the next steps were gathering, ready to move towards something new as the days continued to unfold. When I woke the morning after the panel, the house felt still in that soft way it does after an emotional day. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin, warm lines, and somewhere down the hallway, I could hear Evelyn moving around the kitchen. I sat up slowly, letting the memories of yesterday settle my parents' faces near the exit, their voices thin with worry and the quiet certainty that had guided me as I walked away. Nothing felt jagged or heavy. It was more like a chapter I had been turning toward for a long time had finally found its closing line. I joined my grandmother at the kitchen table where she had already set out 2 mugs of tea. She glanced at me as I sat down and asked if I slept well. I nodded and thanked her, taking the warm mug between my hands. She didn't push for more details, but the gentle look she gave me made it clear she was ready to listen if I wanted to talk. I told her the morning felt lighter, and she smiled in that modest way she always did, as if glad to see the weight shifting without needing to name it. Over the next few weeks, the early heat of summer started to settle across the neighborhood. I finished my schoolwork and prepared for finals from the comfort of her dining room table. My tutoring sessions picked up as families planned for the coming year, and Evelyn made sure I didn't overwork myself. She kept reminding me to take breaks, and we spent more time outside tending to the herb garden. The plants were growing well, their small leaves gathering strength in the warm air, and she said they looked like they had taken to the space we made for them. One afternoon, while we were watering the basil and thyme, she paused and asked if I had heard anything more from my parents. I told her no. She nodded, neither surprised nor unsettled, and said sometimes silence tells its own kind of story. There was no bitterness in her tone. It was simply an acknowledgement. We finished our gardening in an easy rhythm, the soft scrape of watering cans and the smell of damp soil grounding the moment. A few days later, I received information from the school confirming my grades and approving my return for the next year. I showed the email to Evelyn, who hugged me gently and suggested we make a small celebration out of it. We baked a simple cake with vanilla frosting, and she insisted on adding sprinkles, even though the container was nearly empty. As we sat at the kitchen table eating slices of the slightly lopsided cake, she asked what I wanted to do over the summer. The question carried no pressure, only possibility. I told her I planned to continue tutoring and maybe look into volunteering with the mentorship program that had invited me to speak. She nodded approvingly and said it sounded like a good way to keep growing. As June came to a close, my strength felt more certain, and my days carried a clarity I hadn't known before. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, I found myself thinking about that hospital room so many months ago, the cold IV line, the steady beep of the monitor, and my parents' footsteps fading down the hallway. The memory didn't sting the way it once had. It simply existed, a part of the path that had brought me to where I stood now, rinsing plates beneath warm water and listening to my grandmother hum softly beside me. Later that night, we sat on the porch again with cups of tea, watching the fireflies appear in brief flickers across the yard. The air was warm, carrying a faint sweetness from the blooming gardens down the street. I rested my hands on the porch railing, feeling its familiar texture beneath my palms. When Evelyn set her cup down, she turned to me with that clear, steady look she had. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "I hope you know that." I thought about everything that had unfolded, the quiet days of healing, the steady support she offered without hesitation, and the small steps I took toward building something of my own. I told her I did know, and that I was grateful for every ounce of the space she had made for me. She reached out and covered my hand with hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. We sat in silence for a while, letting the night settle around us. In the weeks that followed, I began planning for something new. A small scholarship fund for the students I tutored, something that could help them cover books or fees that might otherwise hold them back. I saved a portion of what I earned and worked with the mentorship group to set it up. When I told Evelyn about it, she smiled with quiet pride and asked how she could help. We spent several evenings creating the structure together, making sure it matched the values we both believed in. As summer deepened, I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I had gained. My parents' choices no longer felt like the center of my story. They were part of the beginning, but not the end. The ending belonged to the people who had stayed, the ones who chose me without hesitation, and the life I had started building alongside them. One warm evening near the end of July, I sat with my grandmother on the porch again, watching the fading light gather on the horizon. She asked if I felt ready for the next school year. I said I did, and for the first time I meant it without reservation. She nodded and said she would be there for whatever came next. Her words settled over me with a sense of peace that reached deeper than I expected. As the first stars appeared overhead, I thought about everything this journey had taught me, how survival often begins in quiet places, how dignity can be reclaimed in small, steady steps, and how justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like choosing to live fully despite the hurt. Sometimes it looks like letting go of those who couldn't choose you and holding close the ones who did. Before we went inside, I took a moment to look out across the yard, feeling the soft summer air against my skin. I knew the road ahead would bring its own challenges, but I also knew I wasn't walking it alone. If you've listened this far, I hope you'll share where you're listening from, and maybe pass this story along to someone who needs a reminder that healing can begin quietly, one honest step at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me.